All right, it is noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. As a heads up, welcome to today's class. We are starting now. Please familiarize yourself with Zoom if you haven't already. So the chat box is disabled. If you'd like me to unmute you so you can ask a question, you can raise your hand and I'll unmute you at the end. Otherwise, you can type your questions into the Q&A box because I'm the only one doing this presentation today. That really helps me to corral all the questions in one place. I'm Katie McCormick. I'm the residential horticulture agent and master gardener volunteer coordinator here in Seminole County. And I'm part of the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences Extension. Extension is one part of the land grant university mission. So they research, they educate, and they extend the information from the university into our different communities. Extension covers a wide variety of topics. Like I said, I'm the residential horticulture agent here in the county, and I'm also the master gardener volunteer coordinator. So what I do is take the information from the University of Florida on landscaping best management practices and new insects and new diseases that might be in the state, and then provide those to the residents here. We also have a food systems and agriculture agent that helps with our growers in the county so that they can learn the best practices for growing on their farms. We have a Florida-friendly landscape agent, Tina, who helps with the homeowners and teaching you guys Florida-friendly landscaping practices, as well as working with our producers and landscapers to get those practices into their working environments. We also have 4-H, which deals with teaching children all of these best management practices. And not just how to raise a cow, but also how to cook. And we do an entomology camp in the summertime for kids. And we also have a family consumer sciences agent who teaches you everything from healthy meal prep to safe meal prep to financial planning to family planning. So all of those things are covered by Extension, and all of those are things that we can teach you here with our Extension service. Some of the upcoming classes we have, my next class is going to be next week on Wednesday, August 25th from noon to 1. We'll be talking about gardening for bees then, not just butterflies today. So you can learn about creating habitat for our native bees and European honeybees in that class. And this is a nice little bumblebee here in the picture. And then Morgan Pinkerton, our Sustainable Food Systems and Agriculture Agent, will be teaching a class called What's That Bug? Intro to Insects and Scouting on August 31st, where she's going to talk about the basics of insect ID, how to actually look for insects in your landscape, and how that relates to integrated pest management and keeping a healthy landscape. You can find the pre-registration links for both of those on our Eventbrite page or on our Facebook page. Both of those will link to the Zoom webinar sign up. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and switch PowerPoints and get us started on our butterfly class for today. So today's class is called Fluttering Flowers, Gardening for Butterflies. And we're going to be going over quite a few different things today as they relate to gardening for butterflies. So first, I'll be talking about our Florida-friendly landscaping principles and how those relate in the landscape to our gardening practices. We'll talk about some of the basics of creating butterfly habitat, some landscape considerations you might want to keep in mind as you're creating these habitats. And then we'll be going over some easy plants for butterflies, as well as some of the butterflies that host on those plants. First, let's talk about our Florida-friendly gardening and Florida-friendly landscaping. So the main founding base of Florida-friendly landscaping is making sure you have the right plant for the right place. If you have a really wet landscape, growing things that prefer to be wet. If you have a really dry landscape, growing things that prefer to be dry. And the same for sun and shade. So making sure that the plants that you select for your yard fit the conditions in your yard, as opposed to trying to fit the conditions in your yard to the plants that you're choosing. Because when you fit your plants to your conditions, you're going to have a much healthier and happier landscape and less of a headache in trying to take care of it. So once we've done right plant, right place, we want to make sure we're watering efficiently. Don't overwater, try not to underwater either. But overwatering in particular can lead to a lot of fungal diseases and root rots and issues in your landscape. So make sure that you're watering efficiently, not too much in your landscape. To help with that, you can also mulch. So especially organic mulches can help to hold moisture in the soil so you don't have to water as frequently. And a 3 to 4 inch layer of mulch will help to keep down your weeds. So starting with right plant, right place, and working our way through to make sure we aren't watering too much. Next, we want to fertilize appropriately. Flowering plants that are attractive to butterflies and host plants that their caterpillars are going to eat are going to need energy to produce those flowers and those leaves. And our sand here in Florida oftentimes doesn't have very much nutrient content, especially when we move into landscapes that have been developed, as most of our urban and suburban landscapes are. Any of the good topsoil that might have been there has been scraped away to make room for construction. So we don't have a lot of nutrient content in the sand that we're dealing with in our yards. Making sure that we fertilize, but we don't use too much fertilizer and don't use fertilizers with quick release nutrients in them that might leak into our waterways is really important and can lead to healthier plants. And also, if we're doing it appropriately, not unhealthy waterfronts. Next, we want to recycle where we can. So when you rake up those leaves, instead of sending them to the landfill, compost them or use them as mulch. And introduce composting into your landscape if possible. A compost bin can be a great way to get rid of those green goods from your cooking that you don't need to use and incorporate those back into the soil where they can be used by your plants. The main component of this class today is attracting wildlife. So we'll be talking a lot about attracting wildlife today and what you need to do that, but that is one of our 9 Florida-friendly principles as well. So making sure we're creating these habitats for wildlife. And hand in hand with that is controlling our yard pest responsibly, which we'll talk about a little bit in this presentation as well. But we want to make sure that when we're controlling for pests, we don't accidentally also kill our beneficial insects. Finally, all of these are really whittled down to help reduce water runoff. So if we've got healthy landscapes with healthy plants in them, we'll have less water running off into our lakes. Instead, it'll percolate down through the soil and get that extra cleaning. And protecting our waterfront so that we don't get red tides and fish kills and algae growing in our waterways. So those are our 9 Florida-friendly principles. They're going to be kind of tied into a lot of what we're talking about today. And there's something that you should keep in mind when you're gardening here in Florida. So let's talk about habitat basics. What do animals need whenever they are looking for habitat? What's one of the things that we might be missing in our landscapes? Or some of the things we might be missing in our landscapes. So all animals are going to need water, which may be the local pond near you, or you could incorporate water as one of the features in your landscape. They're going to need some kind of food. And in a lot of our urban landscapes, that food is pretty lacking because we've replaced it with concrete and lawn. And they're going to need cover and shelter of some kind. Here we've got some egrets nesting in a tree, which is their shelter. For insects, making sure you have layers of landscaping can really help with offering them places to shelter at night whenever they're resting. So making sure we have these 3 things, water, food, and cover and shelter for wildlife, can really increase the wildlife in our yards and also make for a healthier ecosystem all around. So when you compare native habitat, which I've got a picture here of kind of a marshy area, you can see we've got water here. We've got a lot of grasses growing and covering up that water and providing places for different animals to hide. And in the background, we've got a whole bunch of native trees and shrubs in various layers. So our native habitat has layers of grass and shrubs and ground covers and trees all building up into a lot of different shelter and different trophic levels for these animals to survive in and move in. So we've got our predators and our prey all able to live in habitat in this area. In a residential landscape, across the water here, we've got a little bit more of that more native landscape, but in this residential landscape, we've got turf, we've got 3 trees, and we've got a couple of shrubs, none of them native shrubs either. So there's some native sable palms with those cabbage palms, but most of this landscape is pretty much not used by our native insects. So this wouldn't be a really good butterfly garden. There's not really a great nectar source here other than maybe the invasive golden rain tree with those yellow flowers. The turf is offering no place for these butterflies to hide or rest. There's not really anything for them here. So we're not going to see a lot of wildlife hanging out in a yard like this. Finally, when we've got these really highly manicured places like this South Florida golf course where we've got some pretty royal palms, and we have a couple of shade trees kind of around the edges, but almost the entirety of this landscape, even though we have water here, there's no shelter. We've taken away all of the plants that might be around the edge of this pond in order to make it nice and clean for golfing. There's no real good habitat here except for things that want to live in the grass and probably eat turf. So making sure we increase the amount of habitat and the amount of plants in our yards can really increase the amount of wildlife and the amount of butterflies we're seeing. So with our basics here, you can see in each of those pictures, I tried to choose habitats that it had water in them because water is one of the basic needs for everything living on Earth. Your water could be the pond that your house is backed up onto. Sorry, I gotta snooze my restart warning here. It could be that you incorporate some bird baths into your landscape, or maybe a little pond or water feature fountain. For butterflies in particular, they need puddling areas. So for these water, however you're incorporating it into your landscape, you want to keep the water clean. Minimizing mosquitoes is really important. So clean water that you're flushing out regularly will minimize mosquitoes. If you have a pond or you have a little man-made fountain that you're doing and you can incorporate some mosquito fish, those little minnows can eat the mosquito larvae. Also incorporating, if you can't do either of those things, mosquito bits or dunks, which are a bacteria-based mosquito pesticide, can work really well. They only target mosquitoes, so they're not going to hurt any of the butterflies or other animals enjoying your water, but they will keep those mosquitoes from pupating and turning into adults. When you are dealing with something like a pond, making sure that you have shoreline vegetation, and some of our native plants that are host plants for butterflies really prefer to be wet and on a shoreline or in a swampy area, can encourage more wildlife to live where you're living. So you can see more birds and more water ducks and more turtles if you have that shoreline vegetation. And the sound of water can be heard by other animals and increases the attractiveness of the area. So if you have a fountain running or you have your pond lapping up against the shore a little bit, that can really attract more wildlife to your area. So for butterflies in particular, puddling is really important for the males. So artificial puddles can serve as a source of dissolved salts and amino acids for the male butterflies. This would be an area of your garden where you've got an open area that's sunny, and you can put either a clay dish with some sand and stones or mud out for these male butterflies to visit. What they do is they collect those dissolved salts and amino acids, and they pack that down with some of their sperm, and then they offer that as a nuptial gift to the female butterflies. So this is their way of attracting a mate and also passing on their genetics, is with this special gift full of nutrients for the female butterfly. Then whenever she's laying her eggs, she has the sperm there to use, but she also has those amino acids and salts to help her metabolize and lay those eggs later on. So puddling is a really important part for a lot of male butterflies. You can see here, most of the butterflies are sulfur wings, which are a really common butterfly here in Florida. And they're all puddling in order to gather up those amino acids and salts and make those nuptial gifts. So even if you can't afford to put a pond in your yard, or you don't want to have to flush out a butterfly or a bird bath, something like just a shallow dish where you have filled it almost all the way to the top with soil and rocks and left that out for the male butterflies to soak up the minerals that dissolve into it, can be a big help for butterflies. Outside of water, you want to consider food. Oh, we got Q&A. Are the petals better in sun or shade or either? So most butterflies prefer to live in sunny areas. There are some butterflies that don't mind being in the shade. Zebra longwings don't mind that, but most butterflies like to be in a sunnier area. So putting your puddle area either in mostly sun or only semi-shade would be better than putting it in a fully shaded area. You will have it drying out a little bit more often, but in the rainy season, that's not such an issue. All right, next we're going to talk about food. And we'll continue on with our discussion of food when we get to the end and talk about some of our butterfly species and their host plants and nectar plants. But when it comes to food, we want to consider seasonality, the size and shape of the plant, and the abundance of it. For seasonality, when are your plants flowering? When are they producing fruit? And we want to stagger production. So in this particular picture, I went with fruit just because it's really, really noticeable. And also we've got different things fruiting throughout the year, but flowers are the same way. So in the springtime, we might have something like maple seeds available for birds to eat. The fall, you might have persimmons. On and off throughout the year, you might have something like elderberry. All of these plants also are producing flowers, so making sure you're staggering that flower production to increase the amount of butterflies visiting your yards is important. Talk a little bit more about flowers that butterflies like on the next slide. But just to keep in mind, if you have everything flowering all at the same time, you're only going to have those pollinators and butterflies visiting for that short period of time that the plant is flowering, and then they're done. They're going on to a different location where there's more food available. So trying to pick out plants that flower at different times of year can be really helpful for increasing the amount of wildlife and butterflies you see in your landscape. Food for butterflies, if you're picking up flowers and you just go to the landscape nursery and you're trying to find things that might attract butterflies and you didn't come with a list, things to keep in mind is they like brightly colored flowers. So you can see we've got zinnias and marigolds here with some butterflies visiting. They like tubular flowers, so something like the milkweed that those monarchs are on here in the middle, or the pentas over here, or even the butterfly weed here. And they prefer plants that have a landing pad for them. Butterflies have trouble fluttering in place and drinking, so they want to be able to land and move around and drink from multiple flowers if they can before they flutter off to the next one, which is what we're seeing with pretty much all of the flowers we're looking at here. So marigolds and zinnias and fleabane and mist flower, even though these all look like a singular flower to us, these are actually composite flowers. So there are a whole bunch of flowers all stuck together. And that means there's a whole bunch of nectar tubes in these areas all stuck together that these butterflies can land on and then nectar on. So anything that has kind of that daisy shape is usually a composite flower, and it has a lot of different nectar tubes there available for them to go and drink out of. With our butterfly, our milkweed, our butterfly weed, and our pentas, these are all clusters of flowers that are large enough that the butterflies can land on, and then they can walk around nectaring off of the various flowers in these clusters. So when you're picking out flowers, just consider that butterflies are kind of lazy. They want to be able to land and eat their fill as much as possible before they move on to the next flower. And go for brightly colored stuff. If you're trying to attract other pollinators, there are a lot of different flowers out there and a lot of different pollinators out there, and they all like different things. These pollinators and flowers have all grown together to try and attract each other in order for the flowers to be pollinated and for the pollinators to get the food that they prefer. So like I said, butterflies, they like bright colored things, in particular red and purple flowers. Nectar guides, or lines that kind of point to the center of flower, will be present usually for these. And usually they like things that have a faint fresh smell to them. So a little bit of a floral smell, but not really strong. They aren't really going after things with a lot of pollen. So bees might visit something like a sunflower where they walk on that sunflower and get coated in pollen. Butterflies aren't so much into the sunflowers as they are other kinds of daisies and other tubular shaped flowers. And they're looking for those landing pads. If you were trying to attract something like a moth, you'd go for things that smell really deeply at night and have usually lighter colors. Flies, I don't really try to attract flies in my landscape, but flies are looking for stuff with a putrid scent. No nectar guidelines. Usually there's no nectar present at all. What they're doing is being tricked into pollinating these plants because they think they're rotting meat. There are some cactus flowers that do this. So you can see we've got a lot of different flower types and different pollinators that are attracted to them, and not all pollinators are attracted to the same thing. Once you've determined kind of a little bit more about what kind of plants you want in your landscape and consider those needs that the butterflies have, you want to also consider abundance. So if one plant is particularly productive, only plant a couple of those and increase the diversity of your landscaping. Here we've got beautyberry. Beautyberry produces so much fruit that oftentimes birds will leave it to rot on the plant after they've had a little bit of it, because there's just so much fruit there. If you planted a landscape all with beautyberry, you would probably have a lot of rotting fruit left over. It's the same with planting with other nectaring plants in your landscape. If you plant something like only pentas, you're going to have your insects coming to visit those, but there's not a lot of diversity there. They're going to want to go other places to get other nutrient sources and other nectar sources as well. So making sure we have an abundance of different plants and a large amount of diversity in our landscape will increase the diversity of the wildlife visiting. And usually it also reduces the amount of pests you have visiting. When we grow a lot of different plants as opposed to a monoculture of one plant, you're going to have a lot of different beneficial insects and predatory insects showing up. And you won't have your pest insects just finding a feast of the one plant that they like to eat. Instead, maybe they only eat on your penta and your zinnias are fine, or vice versa. So they might prefer one of your plants and the rest are left alone, and you don't really have to treat for them. Next, as you're considering these plants, consider cover. How tall are your plants going to grow? How wide are they going to spread? Generally in a landscape, we want a few taller plants that are providing some shade and shelter for our wildlife. And then a lot of shorter plants that provide those food sources and places for them to land and hide. And in general, they're going to provide that shelter too. So you can see we've got a couple of different landscapes here. All of them have a pretty diverse amount of material. I would say this one in the middle that has a decent flowering bush here and some more small flowering stuff around the base looks like a pretty good butterfly habitat, along with this guy over here with some of our annuals, as opposed to this shade garden where they've gone for mostly palms and ferns and leafy green plants. So this isn't much of a butterfly garden, although it does provide habitat for other things. These last two would be more attractive for our butterflies. But make sure you're layering in your landscape where possible. This will cut down on the amount you have to mow as well. Once these plants are established, they'll shade out weeds and you'll have less grass that you have to take care of. Other landscape considerations for your backyard habitat you should consider. What kind of design do you like? Do you like a more formal aesthetic? Is that going to fit more in your landscape and in your community where you live? Or do you like a more informal aesthetic? Do you like kind of a wildflower garden? Maybe in your front yard, you're a little more formal, and in your backyard, you grow a meadow. What type of wildlife are you most interested in supporting? So this class is about butterflies, and we're going to be talking about some of the plants that they like and their needs, but you might want to attract birds or bees, which we'll be talking about next week. And those are going to have different plants and different needs than butterflies. So what are you trying to attract in your landscape and what do they need? What are your current site conditions is also important. So get a soil test if you don't know what your soil pH is. We do that here at the office for $2. We can tell you what's going to grow well in that pH and what won't. Also consider if you're sunny or shady. You'll need different plants based off of how much shade you have, either from your house or from trees. And also consider what are your realistic plant choices. You shouldn't be trying to grow plants that would prefer to be really wet in a dry habitat. That's wrong plant, wrong place. Also, you shouldn't try to grow plants that prefer to be really dry in a really wet habitat. They're not going to grow well and they'll probably rot. So we can't do a lot of the plants that you might grow up north. We have our own Florida ones that maybe look similar, but consider what's realistic for you to take care of and what will realistically grow here in Central Florida as you're making your choices. Also consider what are the wildlife areas around you. So here in Central Florida and in Seminole County in particular, we've got scrub, flatwoods, sandhills, hardwood hammocks, freshwater marsh. We've got prairie. We've got hydric hammocks. We have forests of abundant cabbage palm, which sounds like something from a fantasy novel. So consider what is the local ecosystem like near to you, and what is your landscape like? Because those are the insects that are going to be nearby, and the butterflies that are going to be nearby are the ones that are already utilizing the natural lands nearby. If you can grow plants that are similar to those in those natural lands, you'll be extending that ecosystem into your yard and more likely to get those local insects in your yard. No matter what the growing conditions, so super dry, super wet, there are native communities of plants and wildlife adapted to live in those systems that will be attracted to them if you extend them into your landscape. This particular cutout here on the right was from the Florida Native Nurseries.org/plant communities website, where you can really look up the plant communities in your area and figure out what might grow there. Also consider we have different butterfly regions in Florida too. So there are butterflies found in the Keys that we will never see up here in Central Florida in Zone 3 because our habitats are so different and the temperatures are so different. So making sure that you're growing plants for the butterflies in your region is pretty important. One website that I really like to use whenever I'm considering region and what plants to use if I want to go with native plants is the National Wildlife Foundation's website. It's nwf.org/native plant finder/plants. And you can use that. It's the screenshot on the left side of the screen here to look up first what plants might grow in your area really well. But most importantly, you can see in each of these little images, there's a butterfly with a number next to it. That's all of the butterfly and moss species that utilize that plant as a host tree. So you can see here at the bottom with our oak tree, 395 different lepidopterans or different moths and butterflies use oak trees as their host plant. If we go with something in the plum or cherry family, 247 different species of butterflies and moths use those as their host plants. So this website is really great for one, looking up native plants for your area, but two, seeing how much of an impact those plants can have on your native lepidopterans, so on your native butterflies in the area. And finally, for our landscape considerations, we want to consider pest control. So where possible, make sure you're doing right plant, right place, and taking care of those plants appropriately so that you don't have to use any pesticide because we have those beneficial insects in our landscape already eating the pests, and the plants aren't stressed, so we're not getting as many pests. You want to do selective pesticides. So my favorite is insecticidal soap in my landscape. You can buy it at almost any garden center or nursery. It's pretty safe even when we're really hot out. And it is a contact killer. So it's not going to, after it dries, hurt anything. So you spray it on to your aphids or your mealybugs. It strips away the waxy coating on their body. They desiccate and die. And then when it dries out, nothing that comes into contact with it will be harmed by it. The same is true with our horticultural and dormant spray oils. These ones, though, are a little bit more dangerous when we're hot. They can burn once we get above 85 degrees. The sun just cooks them onto the leaf. For caterpillars not in your butterfly garden, Thuricide works really well. It only attacks the caterpillars. So in your vegetable garden, if you're getting a lot of cutworms, this would be a good choice. It's not going to hurt anything else, like your bees. And then for fungals or fungicides, garden-friendly fungicide is one that's really nice to use. It's a bacteria-based fungicide. It only attacks other funguses. It doesn't actually hurt any other insects or people. So it's a really good biorational pesticide that's bacteria-based. We want to use these selective pesticides so we don't harm our native beneficial insects, pollinators, or predators. And then going back to those Florida-friendly landscaping principles, we want to use integrated pest management strategies. So before we ever spray, we need to identify the insect that we might be spraying for. Don't just spray on a schedule, but spray only when you have bugs in your landscape that might be a problem. And then once you have that identification, using those cultural controls to make sure your plants are healthy. Mechanical controls, I've got a lubber grasshopper in the background of this slide. The easiest way to kill those guys is to either cut off their heads with your lappers or throw them in a bucket of soapy water and let them drown. You don't spray for them at all. None of our pesticides are going to be strong enough usually to knock these guys down permanently. So just manually killing them is the best way to go about it. And then working your way up from those cultural and mechanical controls into things like the biorational pesticides, which we were discussing here. And then finally, if none of these are working out, into some of those stronger pesticides if you have a really bad outbreak. So next, we're going to talk about some of the plants for butterflies. We'll be talking about trees and shrubs and flowering plants and vines that you can grow for butterflies. Do you guys have any questions on landscape considerations or the stuff we've already covered so far? I'm going to continue then. So easy plants for butterflies. If you're looking for a tree to add to your landscape and you have room for a big shade tree, a live oak tree is one of the best things that you can plant as a host plant for our native lepidopterans, or our native butterflies and moths. Over 395 butterflies and moths utilize this tree in order to lay their eggs and have their caterpillars eat it. It has a lot of leaves when they're grown, so you won't even notice the damage these caterpillars are doing, and it's a host for a lot of different things. We also said on one of the previous slides, Chickasaw plum and other things in the Prunus genus. So all of our plums and native cherries are really great host plants as well. They also flower beautifully in the springtime, and they're a really great nectar plant. We have a Chickasaw plum here in our Florida Friendly landscape at the extension office, and it looks like a fairy tree when it blooms in the spring with all those really beautiful white flowers, and then all of the bees and butterflies are visiting it for that time. Finally, for another smaller tree that you can grow, sparkleberry, which is in the blueberry genus, so Vaccinium, blooms in the springtime with some really pretty little bell-shaped white flowers and is also very attractive. One of the prettiest butterflies that you'll see hosting on live oak, in my opinion, is the white M hairstreak butterfly. They really don't look like much when their wings are closed. They're just kind of brown with a little hint of blue. But when they open those wings up, you can see they have these really gorgeous deep blue wings. And this is a butterfly that's found here in Central Florida, hosting on oak trees. So live oaks are great for this, laurel oaks, white oaks, a lot of different oak species are host plants for these butterflies. Just if I had to pick an oak tree, the live oak is usually the sturdiest one here in Central Florida. So that's what I would pick. Outside of trees, when we get into shrubs, our native Walters viburnum is a really great shrub that you can use both for hedging, either a formal or informal hedge, or you can also sometimes train it up like a really small tree. There are also dwarf varieties of Walters viburnum, and in the springtime, they get really big, beautiful clusters of white flowers that are very attractive to butterflies. The rest of the year, they're just a nice little green shrub. Blueberries, we have about 10 or so different blueberry species found in Florida that are native to this area. They flower in the springtime. They are also a host plant for both the red spotted purple, which you can see here, and the striped hair streak, which that purple or the blue hair streak we saw on the previous slide, this is what he looks like when his wings are closed pretty much. It's just kind of brown with a little hint of orange. This one also has a little hint of blue in its wings when it opens them. So both of these butterflies host on different species of blueberry. Blueberry does prefer slightly acidic soils, but you can grow it in a shadier garden as well. So Walters viburnum prefers a little bit more sun. You can grow in semi-shade, but it's not going to do as well. Many of our blueberries will grow in more shaded situations. They like it a little bit wetter and more acidic. And then finally, for a really great nectar plant that is native to Florida, firebush or Hemilia patens flowers almost year round. It'll stop a little bit in the wintertime, and you get these really pretty red flowers. This is another one that you can train up like a small tree. They grow about 15 feet tall if you do that, or you can keep it pruned down as a really pretty rounded bush that provides a lot of nectar for our native butterflies. Next, we've got vines. So some really easy vines to grow in Florida. Pipe vine, we have native pipe vines and non-native pipe vines. If you can find the native pipe vines, they are better for butterflies. Some of the non-native sold at nurseries are considered invasive in our state of Florida. It is a host plant for both the pipe vine swallowtail, which you can see here with these really beautiful blue and orange wings, and the polydamas swallowtail, which has this stripe of yellow on the back end of its wings. Both of these guys lay their eggs on the pipe vine and their caterpillars eat it. Both of them have caterpillars that kind of look like punk rockers. Their bodies have zebra stripes, and they have these really soft little red nubby spikes that come out of their bodies. The spikes aren't dangerous. You can handle these guys in just fine. But all swallowtails do produce little fake antler type antennae that are stinky. So if you mess with them too much, they'll throw up those stinky antennae to try and scare you off. but you can hold and handle these guys just fine. And as adults, they're gorgeous. Another one that's native and might be accidentally growing in your yard is Virginia creeper vine. So this is one of our native vines. It does sometimes have a bad reputation because it will attach to walls and fences, and it can be hard to get off because it has some pretty good adhesion when it does that. But this is host to a lot of different moth species, and in particular, it's host to the Virginia creeper sphinx moth, which you can see here is a really cool looking kind of army green moth with these really beautiful green wings, and they're quite large as well, 2 to 3 inches. So I know this is a butterfly class, but I wanted to plug in at least one beautiful moth that you can attract by just not weeding Virginia creeper vine if it grows somewhere that's convenient for you. And then finally, passion flower is probably one of the best ones you can grow if you want to attract a lot of butterflies. And our state butterfly, this one flowers in the summertime. The picture here is showing incense, which is a non-native species of passion flower, but it'll still be a great host plant for your native butterflies. There are also native passion flowers available, and there are edible ones as well, where you can get the passion fruit off of them. All of them are hosts for our native butterflies. When you're buying passion flowers, the only ones you want to avoid are burgundy colored flowers and red colored flowers. Neither of those are host plants for butterflies, and if they do accidentally lay eggs on them, the caterpillars will die from the metabolites or the stuff inside the leaves that's trying to keep them off. So avoid red passion flower, but the rest should be fine for your native butterflies. And on these guys, you can get our native our state butterfly, the zebra longwing, which is one of my favorites. These guys, whenever they go to sleep at night, like to roost in a herd. So you'll see 5 to 10 of them all clustered together on the same branch at night, which is really cute. They also prefer to be in slightly more marginal shady areas. So if you have a more shady garden, growing passion flower for your zebra longwings to try and attract them is a good idea because they actually don't mind being in a slightly more shaded garden, as opposed to a lot of these other butterflies that prefer a more open, bright, sunny area. You can also get the Gulf fritillary, which is this really pretty little orange guy. And on the underside of his wings, he has kind of a disco ball almost. So there's these really beautiful metallic patches. And then finally, hosting on passion vine, though not here in Seminole County typically, are the Julia butterflies. So these ones are a really beautiful orange color with those longer wings, kind of like the zebra longwing. These are typically found zone 4 through 7 when it comes to butterfly zones, and we're in zone 3 here in Central Florida. So most of the time you're not going to see Julias here in our area, but if you're growing passion vines, who knows, maybe you will. Next, we've got some flowers. So there are so many flowers you can grow for butterflies here in Florida. We kind of talked a little bit about what you should look for when you're picking them, which is those tubular shapes, bright colors like red and purple and orange, landing pads where they can actually sit and rest. So I just picked 3 that I thought were particularly easy to grow and would attract the most butterflies. First, we have our native ground cover. It's called frog fruit. It does prefer to be in a slightly wetter area if you want it to grow really, really well, but it will grow in a dry area too once established. Frog fruit produces really cute little flowers. It's sometimes called matchstick plant because they look a little bit like matchsticks before they bloom, and it's in the verbena family. It flowers year-round. It produces like a 2 to 3 inch mat when it grows as a ground cover, and it's a host plant for several different butterflies. So it's a host plant for our common buckeye, which is this really beautiful eyed butterfly that you'll see. It's also a host for the Phaon crescent, which has this really beautiful checkered wing to it, and they're super, super cute. So I don't know, I grow a lot of frog fruit in my yard. And finally, one of my favorite butterflies, it's host to the white peacock, which is this white butterfly with this pretty orange edging to the edges of its wings. Sometimes that'll be a little bit brown. They just look so elegant to me. I know colorful butterflies are really attractive, but there's just something so soft and pretty about the white peacock. And all 3 of these will lay their eggs and have their caterpillars eat frog fruit. So if you want to attract 3 different butterflies with one plant here in Central Florida, frog fruit is a really great one to grow. And frog fruit will grow in sun or shade, although it definitely flowers better when it's in the sun. Next, in the center of the slide here, I have pentas. Pentas are not native to Florida, and there aren't any butterflies that host on pentas, but they do produce an abundance of flowers and are a really awesome nectar plant for our butterflies. They grow in sun or shade. They will grow in wet or dry conditions. They're just super, super tough plant and produce a lot of flowers that are attractive to our native pollinators. So even though this isn't a native plant, and even though it isn't a host plant for any of our butterflies, it is one that I really recommend for a butterfly garden, especially if you haven't grown flowers before and you're just starting out. It's a really easy one to grow. And then finally, we've got milkweed, which is host to probably one of the most famous butterflies, our monarch butterflies. When you're growing milkweed, these guys typically are going to flower in the warm season. And we have a lot of different species of milkweed that grow here in Florida. The one you're most commonly going to see at the nursery is tropical milkweed, which is not native to Florida, but monarchs will host on it and queen butterflies will host on it. The milkweed in the background here is Asclepias tuberosa, which is one of our native milkweeds. It goes dormant in the wintertime, which encourages these butterflies to move on and migrate in the winter. We also have pink swamp milkweed, white swamp milkweed, a lot of different milkweeds that grow here in Florida. The main thing with these is if you can, and you're growing the non-native tropical milkweed, if you can in the wintertime, cut that down to the ground to encourage the butterflies to leave your landscape. That can be a really big help. One of the problems we see with monarchs that stay over in a landscape over the course of years, as opposed to migrating away, is that they get a buildup of a disease that's called OE, which is a fungal disease, and it is a sexually transmitted butterfly disease. So I guess you've learned first that butterflies give each other nuptial gifts that contain sperm, and second, that they can have STDs. So with the monarchs, this fungal disease builds up as they mate in the population over time. They'll lay the eggs, and when the female lays the eggs, she inoculates them accidentally with this fungus. The caterpillars emerge and eat it. It also gets onto the milkweed just as the butterflies are flying around and nectaring on it. And as this disease builds up in the butterflies population and in the caterpillar population, over time, you'll start seeing that your caterpillars are getting darker and the dark lines on their bodies are getting larger and fuzzier looking. And over time, as those caterpillars pupate, for a while, when it's a smaller amount of this disease in their population, they'll be able to pupate, but sometimes they'll emerge and their wings are wrong. So they'll emerge and their wings are crinkled or unable to open or a little bit distorted and wrong. Over time, though, as it builds up in their population and you get a really large amount of OE in those caterpillars before they go into pupation, they'll go into pupation and the OE eats them while they're in their chrysalis. So you'll have a chrysalis that the caterpillar spins and it turns black and it never emerges. It just eventually kind of putrefies in there. All of this is to say, if you're going to grow tropical milkweed, cut it down in the wintertime and make those butterflies go away so they don't get too much STDs in their populations. And so we don't have them putrefying in their pupal casings. But the two butterflies that host on milkweed here in Central Florida are going to be our monarchs, which have those kind of pretty orange and white and black wings, and queens, which are a little bit of a deeper shade of orange and don't have as much black to the veins on their wings. With those planting considerations, one thing that I like to do when I'm planning out a garden, honestly, I'm kind of a spreadsheet crazy person, so I like making spreadsheets. But one thing that you can do if you also want to make sure that you're producing flowers and fruits throughout the year for your butterflies is to make up a spreadsheet where you kind of mark down, when is this flowering, when is this fruiting, and that can help you plan out what else do I need to add to my landscape in order to increase the amount of food that I have for these animals or these butterflies. So you can see here, some of these things are flowering all throughout the year. Pentas are a super trooper, flowering February through December if we're warm enough. Whereas some things like red mulberry are really only fruiting in February, or flowering in February, and then we get a little bit of fruit from March to May. If you color code it, like I've done here, you can also see what kind of colors you're getting in your landscape. And that can tie into making sure that you have a landscape that kind of matches up and looks pretty. So this landscape is pretty much pinks and purples with a little hint of red and orange. It might be a little bit startling or not, depending on how you've finagled it. But making sure at the least that you figure out when things are flowering and making sure you have flowers throughout the year is really important for increasing that butterfly presence in your landscape. And I've left us 15 minutes for questions as intended. So if you have questions after class today and want to reach out to us, we have our Seminole County Master Gardener Volunteer Help Desk here from 9 to noon and 1 to 4, Monday through Friday. You can email them, mastergardener@seminolecountyfl.gov. You can call them at 407-665-5550. Or you can come by our office and bring in samples or questions to them at 250 West County Home Road in Sanford. You can also contact me. Again, I'm Katie McCormick. I'm the residential horticulture agent here in Seminole County. I will say I usually respond to email a little faster than I respond to phone calls. My email address is k.mccormick@ufl.edu. My phone number is 407-665-5558. If it's the middle of the night and you need an answer immediately, and neither I or the Master Gardeners are awake to answer your questions, you can also go to Google. In particular, if you go to Google and type in site :Edis plus your topic, so site :Edis butterfly, that'll pop up with all of the University of Florida documents on butterflies. If you go to site :edu and then your topic, so site :edu butterfly, that'll pop up with all of the extension and university documents around the United States on butterflies. EDIS is probably going to tell you the most information about local butterflies, but if you want to learn more about any topic and you aren't finding it on the UF or University of Florida website, then that site :edu plus your topic can be really useful for finding more information. And I'll take questions now. Is there a wasp that attacks monarch caterpillars? So monarch caterpillars are, when they're eating milkweed, they are stashing away a bunch of cardiac glycosides, which makes them unpalatable to most things. But wasps will sometimes attack them and eat them, usually to their detriment, because those glycosides are going to also hurt the wasp as it tries to eat them. Birds will, though, too. So birds will go after the monarch caterpillars. And again, a lot of times they'll try to eat them, discover that they taste really, really bad and spit them out. But that taste testing, especially with young birds, can sometimes result in a lot of your caterpillars going missing. Any other questions? I tried to cover a little bit of everything today, but main takeaway is make sure you got a lot of different plants in your landscape. So what sorts of fruit trees like citrus interface well with butterfly gardening? Anything that produces a lot of flowers is really great for butterfly gardening. So things like citrus that actually produce all those citrus blooms, and then citrus is also a host plant for giant swallowtails here in Florida, work really well. If you don't mind that Chickasaw plums are a little bit small and sour, Chickasaw plums would work really well. We have a lot of things that'll host on that, although a lot of them are colorful moths as opposed to butterflies, and they produce a lot of flowers. We have different, pretty much if it is a native plant to Florida, we have something that'll eat it. So something like a pawpaw or a persimmon are going to have butterflies that host on those. Like I said earlier, with our anything in the blueberry genus, so we've got a lot of different native blueberries as well as non-native blueberries. All of those are also host plants for a lot of different lepidopterans, if not necessarily butterflies, but moths as well. But mostly if you're keeping toward those more native fruit trees, you're going to get more butterfly activity than non-natives. Any other questions? All right, as you guys exit today, you will be getting a pop-up survey from me. I think it's like 4 questions. And that just helps to prove to my boss that I wasn't in here talking to myself for an hour, that I did have other people in here with me. So if you don't mind answering that, it's a huge help for my programming, and also make sure that the state knows that I'm giving classes. And if you have any other butterfly gardens that come up in your head later, or you want to check and see if any of the plants you're thinking about are good butterfly plants, the master gardeners and I are both here to help out with that in your landscaping endeavors in the future. So I guess I'm going to give you guys 10 minutes of your life back today, and I hope you have a good afternoon. Thanks for joining me.